Welcome to Paradigms at paradigms.life, the radio show and podcast that brings you inspiring people with visions of a viable future for life on Earth that includes humans. Hi, I'm Baruch, host of Paradigms. Happy to be here with you. Thanks for tuning in. We've got a really interesting guest on this episode. He's an author. He's been writing for most of his life, which is kind of amazing in itself for someone to start out as a young person knowing they're going to be a writer and then do it. His latest book is called Transcendent, Art and Dharma in a Time of Collapse. It's a collection of essays that examines Western Buddhism, including the rise of what he calls corporate dharma and the secular Buddhist movement. Really interesting essays, and he's quite an interesting fellow. So we're going to talk with him and listen to some great music and stimulate our minds. Okay? All right, here we go. Let's meet my guest on this episode of Paradigms. Curtis White, welcome to Paradigms.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I've been reading your new book, Transcendent, Art and Dharma in a Time of Collapse, and it really made me want to talk with you.
Good. I'm happy to talk.
So before we get into the book, maybe just tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you get into writing? How did you get into this topic? What, you're a person with a lifetime of experience. What's your story?
At my age, that's a longish story, but I grew up in the Bay Area in the high 60s, and that was really the beginning of me, as in terms of who raised me, my family or the counterculture. It was basically the counterculture. So I went to college in San Francisco at the University of San Francisco. Initially, I thought I was going to be a lawyer, but I took one literature class and I said, no, I'm not, I like this. So it was books for me from that point on. And I also started writing then, fiction mostly. Then I went to Johns Hopkins and studied with the postmodern master John Barth and began to publish. I got a PhD at the University of Iowa with a dissertation that was in fact a collection of stories. And then I began to publish books. The earlier ones were all fiction, mostly of a kind of experimental cast. And then a little around 2004, I started writing for Harper's Magazine and some other magazines, and came to the notice of an editor at Harper San Francisco. It was called at the time. It's Harper One now, and did the book The Middle Mind with him, which was very successful. And I've published 5 more nonfiction books since then with Polypoint Press and now with Melville House, who has, thank God, become a sort of permanent home for me in my writing. So I think that's a fairly short version of my life, at least as a writer.
So Buddhism, Dharma, how are these part of your life, and what brings you to, there's so much to talk about with this book, but I'm just sort of approaching how you got to this point.
Well, there's a lot to talk about with the book because it's not a very usual book. You wouldn't mistake it for journalism. You wouldn't mistake it for a straightforward sort of nonfiction book. It's a collection of essays, and each essay finds its own voice, and there's quite a wide variety between them. And yet they're all pretty loyal to a central concern, part of which has to do with Buddhism. Buddhism came into my life in the 80s because in visiting my sister, she lived on Laguna right across the street from the Zen Center. And so they were members of the Zen Center and practicing Buddhists themselves. And so they would take me across the street to hear Dharma talks and things like that. And of course, while I was at their house, I had access to their considerable library. So I started reading books about Buddhism. And because I was also a student of philosophy, I saw a lot of really interesting overlap between Buddhist philosophy or dharma and some Western philosophy, especially the more existential oriented Western philosophy. And then it was just an on and off kind of, I would say, Buddhism has, or at least Theravadan Buddhism has this distinction between the study monks and the practice monks. And for the study monks, they mostly study texts, and the practice monks mostly meditate. So I was very much a study monk for the next 30 years, really. It was sort of on again, off again. I would try now and then to get into a practice, but the circumstances in central Illinois, which is where I was at the time, were not conducive to any sort of serious practice. So I had to wait a while on that. So in the last 10 years, though, I have been closer and closer to being a well-rounded monk, both studying and practicing. And a lot of that was encouraged by the fact that after my book, The Science Delusion, came out, Tricycle Magazine wanted to interview me about it. And so I was amazed. I was already a subscriber to Tricycle, so I was amazed. So I said, sure, I'd love to be in Tricycle. And so we did that interview. And then I started working with Andrew Cooper, who's one of the editors at Tricycle. And I showed him some essays that I had done, which were basically, they certainly had a Buddhist angle to them, but they were basically literary essays in most ways. But they liked them a lot. And so I've been in their pages another half dozen times since then. But writing for Tricycle made me feel like at last I was part of a community. At last, the sort of Buddhist community had sort of opened the door to me and I was in. And now I'm still in touch with Tricycle, although I haven't written for them in a while. But I have a local Sangha here in Port Townsend, Washington, that I'm very active with. And there are great online Sanghas, Sangha Live coming out of France with Martin Aylward is a really great site. You can hear a Dharma talk there and meditate every morning, basically. So between those virtual Sanghas and my actual Sangha and my ongoing, daily meditation and reading, it's a big part of my life. No one's more surprised about that than I am, but I love it.
I'm talking with Curtis White, author of the new book, Transcendent, Art and Dharma in a Time of Collapse. We've just been hearing a bit about how Curtis got into writing and his relationship with Buddhism. We're going to hear some music now, and then we'll be back with more of this conversation. Let's start out with something from Jethro Tull, Dharma for One, from the album Living in the Past. This is Paradigms at paradigms.life.
There's the stillness of death on a deathly unliving sea, and the motor car magical world long since ceased to be. When the Eve-bitten apple returned to destroy the tree, incestuous ancestors share a bang ride, spawning new millions, throws the world on its side, supporting their far-flung illusion, the national curse. And those with no sandwiches, please get off the bus. The excrement bubbles, the centuries slime decays, and the brainwashing government lackeys would have us say it's under control and we'll soon be on our way to a grandeur for babies and quiz panel games of the hot, hungry millions. You'll be sure to remember We wandered through quiet lands, felt the first breath of the snow, searched for the last pigeon, slate gray, I've been told. Stumbled on a daffodil which she crushed in the rush, heard it sigh and left it to die. At once felt remorse and were touched by the loss of our own. Held its poor broken head in her hands, dropped soft tears in the snow. And it's only the taking that makes you what you are. Wondering aloud, will the sun one day be born to share in our infancy, in the child's path we've worn? In the aging seclusion of this earth that our birth did surprise, will open his eyes.
So welcome to the real world, where there's nowhere to hide from the pain and hurt. Oh, you got to take it in stride. You say you got your big problems, baby, join the club. You won't find the solutions, oh, with the gun or a drug. In a revolution, shake it up, baby. There's something in your life you don't like, you got the power to change it. You can't fix it with a drug, you can't kill it with a gun. No, in a revolution, oh, that's the way it's done. So welcome to the real world, full of pain and hurt, where there's a million excuses, oh, you know what they're worth. You say you got your big problems, like everybody else. You won't find any answers, oh, till you find yourself in a revolution. Shake it up, baby. There's something in your life you don't like, you got the power to change it. You can't fix it with a drug, you can't kill it with a gun.
heard Adrian Belew, an acoustic version of his song Inner Revolution from his album Coming Attractions. Before that, we heard Jethro Tull, Dharma for One. And now we're going to get back to my conversation with the author of the new book, Transcendent, Art and Dharma in a Time of Collapse, Curtis White.
You know, Tricycle is just such an incredible publication. I remember reading, when it first came out in the 90s, I remember reading an article by Jack Kerouac in which he really talks about the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path. And it was life-changing for me. Just these ideas are actually very simple.
They are.
When one reads them, it's clear that, oh, I've actually been living with this my whole life and didn't know it.
Right.
So I was really happy to read your perspective on looking at how the West was sort of waiting for Buddhism, and it got here, and the effect that it's having, and the ways in which it does sort of interface and have overlap with some of the more modern Western philosophies.
Right. You know, one of the dangers of writing about Buddhism is, of course, that you become attached to a particular view, as they call it, you know, and I don't have a view. My Buddhism is very Buddhism 101-ish, you know. I know the basic sutras and, you know, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and, you know, all of that stuff that is fundamental to Buddhism. And it's one of the things actually that I think is really working in the United States with Buddhism is that there's a kind of, you know, after the 70s, and all of the failures and the scandals with gurus, the American Buddhist community has essentially detached itself from that kind of model of study. And now there's a kind of textual fundamentalism, that is to say, here are the basic arguments that the Buddha laid out in the early Pali Sutras. Added to that is always a kind of breath-focused meditation. So those two things are really the heart and soul, I think, of healthy American Buddhism. Beyond that is the more mystical or tantric part of Buddhism that's usually associated with the Tibetans, but is present in all the schools of Buddhism. And that is the idea that you can have what William James called mystical experiences that are both ineffable, but also totally convincing and, you know, as if you know, experiences that make you think you've learned something about the cosmos, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So those are the basic two things he identifies with a kind of mystical experience. And that, I think too, you know, no one talks about that as much, but I think that that's also present in American Buddhism, because people, when they really study Buddhism and practice, I think many of them do have kinds of, I know I have had mystical experiences. So those three things, it seems to me, are really working well in American Buddhism. There are other things that are much more problematic, and a good part of the book is focused on them, especially the way in which mindfulness has been taken up by corporations and has been detached from, you know, sort of the historical teachings and practices of the Buddha and made more about science. And so I spend a good deal of time in the opening chapter, which is called Beyond the Data-Based Buddha, sort of dismantling and critiquing. You know, it's really a critique of that aspect of American Buddhism, mm-hmm. because, you know, they will say, well, this isn't Buddhism per se. This is something very practical. It's mindfulness, and you can use it in this corporate setting, et cetera. But, you know, that line tends to disappear, so that, you know, the people who are doing that study and that practice end up thinking, well, this is Buddhism, you know, and eventually, as I say a number of times in the book, eventually we forget that Buddhism ever had its own meaning. And it's really important that we remember that it does.
Basically, what I got from reading this is this guy is you trying to figure out the same questions we've all been asking forever, which is, what are we? What are we doing here? How do we function? And let's look at what we're doing with a critical eye, not an emotional eye, but in terms of what's working.
Right.
You know, the commodification of Buddhism, of any kind of practice or faith path or spiritual path or whatever we want to call it.
Mhm.
You know, we see the commodification of these things as part of the behemoth bulldozer of, you referred to money as a fiction, I refer to money as a fiction, and so I loved seeing that, you know, a social fiction, that this allegiance to this exalting of the mind and of our fantasies over what we actually experience. It's a problem for humanity.
Yeah. Right. Well, Marxism calls it ideology, and Buddhism calls it conventional reality. And Buddhism is basically dedicated to removing us from the grips of conventional reality. For example, believing that money actually has value, and the way that money becomes sort of like the dominant sign for all of Western culture. Marxist theorist Antonio Negri called it the sociality of money, in which every relationship, either between people and things or people and other people, is mediated by money, the sociality of money, a very powerful concept. And so that's what the Buddha would call conventional reality. That is nothing but suffering, both for you, others, and the planet, and we need to liberate ourselves from it. Mostly he meant socially liberate ourselves from it, which is just sort of another striking similarity with the Marxist tradition. But, you know, one of the ways that I think about what's going on with corporations and Buddhism is this old leftist saying that capitalism knows it will have enemies, but if it must have enemies, it will make them itself and in its own image. I mean, that's such a clarifying statement for me, because that's what has happened. Buddhism is presented to capitalism as a kind of enemy because its meanings and its values are completely contrary to corporate capitalism, to any form of capitalism, you know? And so Buddhism presents itself as an enemy. And so capitalism needs to it doesn't like having enemies, but it can learn from them. And one of the things that it learns is how to co-opt them, just as we saw with the 60s counterculture, how that was co-opted by Madison Avenue and capitalism in general.
Very interesting talking with Curtis White about Buddhism and its role in Western society. We'll be back with more conversation after we hear some music, going along with Curtis's countercultural bent. Here is George Harrison and Leon Russell, Beware of Darkness, from the Concert for Bangladesh, which happened in 1971.
Watch out now, take her, beware of falling swinger. Dropping all around you, the pain that often mingles in your fingertips. Beware of darkness. Watch out now, take her, beware the thoughts that linger. Winding up inside your head, the hopelessness around you in the dead of night. Beware of sadness, it can hit you, it will hurt you, make you so what is more, that is not what you are here for. Watch out now, take care, beware, soft you shuffling watch out now. Take a beware of greedy leaders. They take you where you should not go. While weeping at the cedars, they just won't grow and grow. Beware of darkness. Beware of darkness. Every lesson, oh, we find a message which praises the gift of being present. In essence, it may create a certain state of realization through which one becomes centered. Let me dwell in silence, oh, a thought-provoking challenge. To be mindful in each moment, every second, the path to freedom ever beckons. When I'm mindful, day by day around the planet, people simply cannot seem to find the time for calm abiding in the chaos. Yeah, with so much wasted energy as far as how I'm recreating, how can I live my life without having the way be lost? May I raise my standards, oh, my thoughts under commando. When I'm mindful, with my resolve firmly planted, passing states easily handled. Being mindful, although utopia may never be physically actualized on earth by mankind, through ethics, concentration, and wisdom, may we find it by being mindful. Somewhere in every lesson, oh, we find a message which praises the gift of being present. Free me from my cravings and diversions all the same. When I'm mindful, oh, it's how we live our lives and how I pray we'll die. Being mindful. When I'm mindful, when you're mindful, when we're mindful.
That's Joan Zen with their song Being Mindful. Joan Zen is a band out of Hamilton, Montana. They have a new record coming out soon. We're going to have them on the show to talk about that. They've been on Paradigms before. Before that, we heard George Harrison and Leon Russell, Beware of Darkness. Just a look at how the mind can be a minefield. All right, Here's the next part of my conversation with Curtis White. You're listening to Paradigms at paradigms.life.
Every time I hear any of the songs from the 60s in a commercial, cringe doesn't even begin to cover it.
Yeah, they're quite shameless about that.
It's such an insult to the ethos and the embracing of change that was happening, and that is a necessary part of human evolution always. But capitalism is an expert at co-optation.
Well, another thing that I emphasize in the book is that one of the reasons that Buddhism was taken up so strongly by the counterculture is because Buddhism is itself a counterculture. So more than being a religion, I think, is a counterculture. It's the presentation of a system of meanings and values and practices that are entirely outside of the way of thinking dominant in the dominant culture.
And antithetical.
Antithetical, absolutely antithetical. I mean, as a child of the counterculture, I hold these truths most dearly.
Absolutely. Well, right now it seems that we, as a world, as a species, as a people, we're really faced with the mirror. We're really having to look at what we have wrought, because the problems that we're experiencing, other than the occasional natural occurrence that disrupts human life, the rest of it, pretty much all our creation, from the degradation of the biosphere to the degradation of social context and all of it's human. We make all of this, and we make it out of our imaginations. We make it out of our desires. We make it out of our fears. And now we kind of get it, that that's what we're doing. I think maybe we haven't reached critical mass yet, but we're headed there. Maybe it's by the skin of our teeth in time. Maybe it isn't. We'll find out. Right. But we are faced with this. And in personal growth, I mean, my work is as a therapist, right? So in personal growth, it's ultimately always about looking at, self-introspection, self-examination, and learning from that and our outside experiences to grow as a person, to become a quote unquote better person. And as a species, if we're each a cell in this one body of humanity, this human being that we are part of is now having this opportunity to look at itself in a way that as a whole maybe has never happened before. And I think your book is like a piece of encouraging the awareness of that.
Well, the book is, I think, is a positive book. I mean, it certainly sets out to be. One of the things that science and corporations has done this goes back 200 years to Darwin and Thomas Huxley, who was called Darwin's bulldog. Its opposition to any form of religion, its desire to eliminate any form of religion, and really the arts as well, from any kind of ideological or intellectual competition with the sciences. So one of the things that goes out with the bathwater is the idea of any kind of transcendence or a beyond, which is usually called by by people like Stephen Batchelor is called a metaphysics. And so one of the things I want this book to do is sort of to remind people that transcendence is not merely the idea of ghosts or angels floating around in some vague heaven. It's a very practical thing and an unavoidable thing. So I talk about three kinds of transcendence in the book. The first is everyday transcendence. And that is, you can't get through a day without the sort of metaphysics of transcendence. That is to say, when you think to yourself that I care for someone, or that I feel compassion for someone, that I feel love for someone, no one knows what those terms mean, but you couldn't live without them.
Yep.
So those are transcendental concepts. Those are metaphysical concepts, and they're so ordinary, right? The second kind of transcendence I really want to remind people of that. You're living in transcendence. The second thing is what I call social transcendence, which is basically the idea that we can both oppose and to go beyond the social forms that we were born into. What Buddhism calls the forms and conditions. Mainly, they mean, they use two words to describe it: samsara, or the world of suffering and change, and karma. we're born into a certain kind of karma. And inevitably, we end up picking up most of it and allowing it to define who we are. Well, Buddhism is an enemy of conventional reality. So it says you can transcend that. And the beginning of it for Buddhism is the Sangha, the alternative community, right? And then the third kind of transcendence that I talk about, and mostly I talk about this through Western art in the last 3 chapters, is the idea of spiritual transcendence. What I really try to do in those last 3 essays, which one is a poem, one is a story, and one is a sort of rhapsody, is to remind us of the feeling of that sort of emotional transport towards the mystic, towards that thing that we don't know exactly what it is, we don't know exactly how to express it, but that, you know, in many, many ways, it's what makes our life meaningful. So those are the 3 kinds. And really, those to me are the last 3 essays are the heart of the book. They're not physically at the heart of the book, but I sort of felt like I needed to get the hard stuff out of the way up front, namely critique, and then arrive at the end of the book, arrive at this sort of clarity.
We'll be back with the final part of my conversation with Curtis White, author of Transcendent Art and Dharma in a Time of Collapse. But now we're going to listen to some mantra, a Tara chant, Om Tara Tu Tare Tura Soa. And this is performed by Mercedes Belida and Klaus Hilbrecht from their album Sacred Chants to Tara.
Om Tara, Om Tara, Om Tare Tu Tare Ture Soha, 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 Om Tare Tu Tare Ture
Mercedes Baleda, and Klaus Hilbrecht with a chant, Tutara, Om Tare, Tutare, Ture Soa. I hope you were able to relax into that and let the chant move through you. And now here's the final part of my conversation with Curtis White.
I have two last things to ask you about.
Okay.
The first one is mind. So humans have been forever asking, what are we and why are we here and what are we doing and all this stuff. But what we know is that we function from this mind, this divine mind that we have, that no one can quantify and no one knows where it comes from. I mean, none of that stuff. The great mystery continues to be a great mystery. Mm-hmm. But as an observer, I would say of humanity, seems to me that that's one of the ways to describe you, and someone who's been living as a human for this much time, what are your personal discoveries about creativity and the mind and source?
Like I said, this may be disappointing, but I don't know how to describe it. I'll give you an instance, though, and it has to do with this book. My last book was called Living in a World That Can't Be Fixed. And I said, okay, that's it. That's my final statement. I'm done. I'm going to go back and write some stories. But then essay ideas started coming to me. Boom. I'd finished that one. Here's another one. They were almost lined up. There's an English word for it, which is unbidden. Mm. I did not ask for them. And it sort of reminds me of what the Greeks used to call the muse, It feels like that. But of course, I don't have a rational explanation for how this book happened. It just happened. So in some ways, over the course of a lifetime, and I've spent virtually every day of my life in the morning studying and writing, studying and practicing. But over the course of a life, your brain or your mind changes in a way that it becomes this sort of conduit. And I think this is very similar to what more religious people experience. There seems to be this sort of conduit to something that you can't explain, but that ultimately is the ultimate sort of meaningfulness of your life. And I think people have that in lots of different ways, whether it's with art or with religion or with nature or with, interpersonal relations, particularly powerful cases of being in love, for example. So that's what I would say. I hope that begins to be somewhat satisfying for you.
But it's a great answer, because what I hear you saying is we can connect to something that even if we don't fully understand it.
Right. Absolutely.
That is the willingness to embrace letting go of understanding is one of the things that leads humans to a greater sense of satisfaction and, right. and a feeling of belonging in this world and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I like that. Letting go of understanding. That must have some transference for you in your business in terms of, say, I'm really depressed. Why? And then you start looking for reasons why. And sometimes those reasons don't really ultimately explain anything. And the answer comes from either doesn't come or comes from a very different place.
Yep. And sometimes the explanation is very astute, but it is not useful in dealing with it. And sometimes the explanation is useful. It's never one, it's all right. Many, many. The second thing I want to ask you about, or the final thing I want to ask you about, is the Sangha, because I think your conclusion ultimately, which could be said in many, many ways, is my interpretation is we humans need to get it together and be in conscious community in order to survive, period.
Yeah. I'm very influenced by the Marxist critical tradition. The larger part of me, as I've said a number of times already, is countercultural. That is to say, we have to build communities. I mean, I don't believe in revolution. I don't believe in revolution because it's always taking place within a damaged set of circumstances, the nation state in particular. If the problem is to get rid of the nation state, it can't be fixed. So what I'm about is growing community. A lot of people say that the counterculture failed, but mostly that's people who never liked it to begin with, saying it failed. Because if you look around, virtually everything that is important to us now, politically and socially, was begun in the counterculture. So, organic gardening, small farming, farmers markets, just stuff like that. It all traces back to the sort of liberation movement, the, do-it-yourself movement, or the back to the land movement that was in the 60s.
Yep.
I don't want to go back to the 60s. I want to proceed.
Yes, but let's learn from what we experienced and take the value forward with us. And I like to just say, yeah, the hippies were right.
Right. Brother.
I really, I recommend that people read this book. There are specific statements you've made in here that are particularly pithy, that resonate, but you also embrace the ongoing questioning. And I think that that's wonderful. This is not the definitive book of answers. Now you don't need to ask any more questions. This is a book that says, here's some stuff we know, and here's some stuff we don't know. And what do you think? And what are your questions? And I think that goes back to the larger state of humanity in its self-examination.
Right.
So I think this is a wonderful piece of the conversation.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking with you.
It's a pleasure talking with you, and I'm now going to look into your other books.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Curtis. Really a pleasure.
Yeah. Be well.
Curtis White, thank you so much for being on the show. Really interesting conversation. Curtis's book of essays, Transcendent, Art, and Dharma in a Time of Collapse, well worth reading for a number of reasons. It's just interesting, first of all, but really stimulating to think about the role of mind in life and to look at how Buddhism came to the West and its role. So many people are attracted to what Buddhism has to offer, more as a practice than anything else, which is part of what Curtis is writing about. Interesting person. And if you'd like to know more about Curtis White, his writings, you can do an internet search for him. Just search for Curtis White author. You can also find his essays in Tricycle Magazine, some older issues of The Village Voice, and he's written numerous books, fiction and nonfiction. So definitely encourage you to check out Curtis White. And if you enjoyed this episode of Paradigms, I hope you'll check out our archive at the Paradigms website, paradigms.life. Over 560 episodes going back 14 years. You can also find Paradigms wherever you find your podcasts, on SoundCloud, and on YouTube at Paradigms Podcast. Paradigms has a Patreon campaign to help pay the bills. It's at patreon.com/paradigms. I hope you'll check it out and become a supporter. We really appreciate the support. I really enjoyed talking with Curtis White, and I enjoyed reading his book, more in the vein of exploring what we are and how we operate and where we're headed and what our choices are as humanity, being consciously mindful of the present moment. That's life. So I think we'll let the word for the week be now. Let's just be in now. We're going to end the show with one more track of music, as we always do. This is something from our friend Pit Quattrone and his band Three Trees. It's called East by Southeast. This is Baruch signing off for this episode of Paradigms. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back next time with more inspiring people. Until then, let's just be in now and be well.
With
You've been listening to Paradigms at paradigms.life.